Chapter 2. Korea at War, 1950–53. Preparations for war. In December 1948, the Republic of Korea's Department of National Defense was established. By June 1950, when the war between the North and South broke out, South Korea had a 98,000-man force equipped only with small arms, which was barely enough to deal with internal revolt and border attacks. The U.S. occupation forces completely withdrew from Korea by June 1949, leaving behind them a force of about 500 men as a U.S. military advisory group to train the South Korean armed forces. In October 1949, the United States granted South Korea $10,200,000 for military aid and $110,000 for economic aid for the fiscal year 1950, the first year of a contemplated 3-year program. In addition, the U.S. Congress approved $10,970,000 for military aid in March 1950. The military equipment committed under the U.S. Military Assistance Program was still en route, however, when North Korean troops invaded the South in June. South Korea was thus unprepared to resist the total invasion from the North. Military preparations for the conflict with the South had been much more extensive in North Korea. Early in 1946, the Soviet authorities had organized a 20,000-man constabulary and army units. And in August, the North Korean Army was established, its title changing to the Korean People's Army. In February 1948, the Soviet occupation forces left North Korea in December 1948, leaving behind for training poses 150 advisors for each Army division. In March 1949, the USSR concluded a reciprocal aid agreement with North Korea, in which it agreed to furnish heavy military equipment, and by June 1950, North Korean forces numbered 135,000, including a tank brigade. As early as 1946, the Soviets were sending thousands of Koreans to the USSR for specialized training, and during 1949 to 50 China transferred about 12,000 Korean troops from its army to the North Korean forces. The North Korean forces were thus far superior to those of South Korea in training and equipment when, on June 25, 1950, North Korean troops launched a full-scale invasion of the South. Invasion and 1950–51. South to Pusan, the South's defense. However, over the course of the next year, the communist leadership built the KPA into a formidable offensive force modeled after a Soviet mechanized army. The Chinese released Korean veterans from the People's Liberation Army so that they could join the KPA efforts, while the Soviets V armaments. By 1950, the North Koreans enjoyed substantial advantages over the South in every category of equipment. After another Kim visit to Moscow in April 1950, Stalin finally approved an invasion. In early 1949, Kim Il-sung pressed his case with Stalin that the time had come for a conventional invasion of the South. Stalin refused. Concerned about the relative unpreparedness of the North Korean armed forces and about possible U.S. involvement in soldiers in a tank regiment of the North Korean People's Army, KPA, line up in this undated photograph taken during the Korean War. AFP Getty Images. In the pre-dawn hours of June 25th, the North Koreans struck across the 38th parallel behind a thunderous artillery barrage. The principal offensive conducted by the KPA I Corps, 53,000 men, drove across the Imjin River toward Seoul. The two corps, 54,000 soldiers, attacked along two widely separated axes, one through the cities of Siechun Changdon and Inya to Hongcheon, and the other down the East Coast Road toward Gangnam. The KPA entered Seoul in the afternoon of June 28th. But the North Koreans did not accomplish their goal of a quick surrender by the re-government and the disintegration of the South Korean army. Instead, remnants of the Seoul area Roca forces formed a defensive line south of the Han River, and on the East Coast Road Roca units gave ground in good order. Still, if the South was to stave off collapse, it would need help. Their only possible allies at this time were the U.S. Armed Forces. Truman's initial response to North Korea's invasion of the South was to order MacArthur to transfer munitions to the Roca and to use air cover to protect the evacuation of U.S. citizens. Instead of pressing for a congressional declaration of war against North Korea, which he regarded as too alarmist and time-consuming when time was of the essence, Truman went to the United Nations for sanction. Under U.S. GUID, ANTS, the UN called for the invasion to halt June 25th, then for the UN member states to provide military assistance to the ROK June 27th. By charter, the Security Council considered and passed the resolutions, which could have been vetoed by a permanent member such as the Soviet Union. The Soviets, however, were boycotting the Council over the issue of admitting Communist China to the UN. Congressional and public opinion in the United States, meanwhile, supported military intervention without significant dissent. Having demonstrated its political will, the Truman administration faced the unhappy truth that it did not have much effective military power to meet the invasion. MacArthur secured the commitment of 3 divisions from Japan, but U.S. ground forces only expanded the scope of defeat. For almost 8 weeks, near Ozen along the Kum River, through Taichung and south to Taegu, U.S. soldiers fought the KPA and died, and some fled. Weakened by inadequate weapons, limited numbers, and uncertain leadership, U.S. troops were frequently beset by streams of refugees fleeing south, which increased the threat of guerrilla infiltration. These conditions produced unfortunate attacks on Korean civilians, such as the firing on hundreds of refugees at a railroad viaduct near the hamlet of Nogan-ri, west of the Naktong River, during the last week in July. It was not until the first weeks of August that the United Nations Command, or UNC, as MacArthur's theater forces had been redesignated, started to slow the North Koreans. The 8th Army, primary document, Harry S. Truman's United Nations Police Action in Korea statement. 2 days after the June 25th invasion of South Korea by the KPA, President Truman released a statement excerpted below on the American government's attitude toward the Korean crisis. Bulletin, July 3, 1950, page 5. In Korea, the government forces, which were armed to prevent border raids and to preserve NAL security, were attacked by invading forces from North Korea. The Security Council of the United Nations called upon the invading troops to cease hostilities and to withdraw to the 38th parallel. This they have not done, but, on the contrary, have pressed the attack. The Security Council called upon all members of the United Nations to render every assistance to the United Nations in the execution of this resolution. In these circumstances, I have ordered United States air and sea forces to give the Korean government troops cover and support. I have similarly directed acceleration in the furnishing of military assistance to the forces of France and the Associated States in Indochina and the dispatch of a military mission to provide cloths. In working relations with those forces, I know that all members of the United Nations will consider carefully the consequences of this latest aggression in Korea in defiance of the Charter of the United Nations. A return to the rule of force in international affairs would have far-reaching effects. The United States will continue to uphold the rule of law. commanded by Lieutenant Gen. Walton H. Walker, one of the best corps commanders in Europe in 1944 to 45, and the Roca, led by Major General Chung Il Quan, rallied and fought back with more success. Supplies came through the port at Pusan, where the 8th Army's logistics system depended on Korean and Japanese tech, munitions, and on thousands of Korean laborers. To stop the North Koreans' tanks and supporting artillery and infantry, Walker brought in Sherman and Pershing medium tanks, rocket launch airs, artillery pieces, anti-aircraft guns, and, most important of all, close-air support aircraft. The 5th Air Force attacked forward units of the KPA with World War II era P-51 Mustangs, new jet-powered F-80s and F-84s, and even B-26 and B-29 bombers. U.S. Marine Corps squadrons, embarked on Navy light carriers, were capable of flying anywhere along the front in quick response to requests from ground forces and on the East Coast of the U.S. Navy's cruisers and destroyers became a seagoing heavy artillery for the Rockeye Corps. Meanwhile, fresh U.S. Army and Marine Corps units began to arrive, supplemented by a British Commonwealth Brigade. In the same period, the Roca, which had shrunk to half its pre-war strength through deaths, surrenders, a few defections, and substantial tie-ins, began to bring its ranks back up with reservists, student volunteers, and men impressed from city streets as the South Koreans fell back. Concerned that the shift of combat power toward the UNC would continue into September, the field commander of the KPA, General Kim Chaek, ordered an advance against the Naktong River, Taegu, Yongdok Line, soon to become famous as the Pusan Perimeter. The major effort was a double envelopment of Taegu, supplemented by drives toward Masan and Pohang, the southwestern and northeastern coastal anchors of the perimeter. None reached significant objectives. At the Battle of Tabudong, August 18th to 26th, the ROK 1st Division and the U.S. 27th Regimental Combat Team defeated the North Koreans' main armored thrust toward Taegu. By September 12th, the KPA, its 2 corps reduced to 60,000 men, and its tank forces destroyed, have been driven back in most places west of the Naktong and well away from Taegu and Pohang. At that moment, the entire strategic balance of the war was shifted by the sudden appearance of the U.S.-led X-Corps at Incheon. North to the Yalu, MacArthur did not believe that he could win the war without an amphibious land, NG deep behind enemy lines, and he had started to think about a landing as early as July. For the core of his landing force, he and the Joint Chiefs of Staff assembled the X-Corps to be commanded by Major Gen. Edward M. Almond, MacArthur's Chief of Staff. The Corps included both U.S. and South Korean Marine and Infantry divisions, as well as an assortment of U.S. support troops. For the landing site, MacArthur himself fixed on Incheon, the port outlet of Seoul on Korea's west coast. After a naval gun and aerial bombardment on September 14th, Marines assaulted a key harbor defense site, Woolmi Island. The next day, and then in the late afternoon, took Incheon itself. The North Korean resistance was spread too thinly over the area, and the 1st Marine Division, ACOM, pawnied by ROK and U.S. Army units, entered Seoul on September 25th. The bulk of the 7th Division advanced to Suwon, where it contacted the 8th Army on the 26th. MacArthur and Syngman remarched into the damaged capital build, ING, and declared South Korea liberated. As an organized field force, the KPA disintegrated, having lost 13,000 as pre-oneers and 50,000 as casualties in August and September. Nevertheless, about 25,000 of its best troops took to the mound, Tains, and marched home as cohesive units, while another 10,000 remained in South Korea as partisans. As the Communists headed north, they took thousands of South Koreans with them as hostages and slave laborers. They also left additional thousands of South Koreans executed in their wake, most infamously at Taichung, where 5,000 civilians were massacred. The ROK Army and National Police, for their part, showed little sympathy to any Southern Communists they found or even suspected, and U.S. aircraft attacked people and places with little restraint. As a result, the last 2 weeks of September saw gruesome atrocities rivaling those seen in Europe during the fratricidal 30 Years' War of the 17th century. Even before the Incheon landing, MacArthur had thought ahead to a campaign into North Korea. Those plans never went beyond establishing a line across the so-called waste of Korea, from Pyongyang in the west to Wonsan in the east. On September 27th, the Joint Chiefs gave him final authority to conduct operations north of the 38th parallel, although he was instructed to limit operations in the event of Russian or Chinese intervention. For the UNC, the war aim was the ROK Army and National Police, for their part, showed little sympathy to any Southern Communists they found or even suspected in U.S. aircraft attacked people and places with little restraint. As a result, the last 2 weeks of September saw gruesome atrocities rivaling those seen in Europe during the fratricidal 30 Years' War of the 17th century. Even before the Incheon landing, MacArthur had thought ahead to a campaign into North Korea. Those plans never went beyond establishing a line across the so-called waste of Korea, from Pyongyang in the west to Wonsan in the east. On September 27th, the Joint Chiefs gave him final authority to conduct operations north of the 38th parallel, although he was instructed to limit operations in the event of Russian or Chinese intervention. For the UNC, the war aim was expanded, as announced by the UN General Assembly on October 7th. Their goal was to include the occupation of all of North Korea and the elimination of the KPA as a threat to the political reconstruction of Korea as one nation. To that end, ROKA units crossed the parallel on October 1st, and U.S. Army units crossed on October 7th. The ROK-I Corps marched rapidly up the East Coast Highway, winning the race for Wonsan, and Pyongyang fell to the U.S. I Corps on October 19th. The Kim Il-sung government, with the remnants of 9 KPA divisions, fell back to the mountain town of Kangi. 2 other divisions, accompanied by Soviet advice, airs and air defense forces, struggled northwest toward the Yalu River and the Chinese border at Sinu. The UNC assumed that the KPA had lost its will to fight. In reality, it was awaiting rescue. In focus, Incheon landing. On September 15th to 26th, 1950, an amphibious landing was made by U.S. and South Korean forces at the port of Incheon, near the South Korean capital, Seoul. A daring operation planned and executed under extremely difficult conditions by MacArthur. The amphibious landing reversed the tide of the war, forcing the invading North Korean army to retreat and disorder up the Korean peninsula. MacArthur had started to think about a landing somewhere behind enemy lines in early July 1950. On August 12th, he ordered his staff to prepare for an amphibious landing at Incheon. Despite the coastline, they're presenting every possible disadvantage for such an operation. The tidal varia time was approximately 30 feet, permitting use of the beaches for only 6 hours out of each 24. The only approach to the port was through a narrow, tortuous channel, blocked by a key harbor defense site, Wolmi Island. And the port facilities of Incheon were inadequate to support a major operation. However, MacArthur knew that practically the entire KPA had been committed to the assaults on Pusan. The Incheon, Seoul area was weakly held, and nowhere else were the North Koreans' lines of communication so vulnerable or accessible. Furthermore, Seoul, as South Korea's capital, was psychologically important to the restoration of South Korea's independence, and MacArthur was determined to reverse the war and restore the United States' damaged prestige as soon as possible. For the core of his landing force, MacArthur and the Joint Chiefs selected the 1st Marine Division and the 7th Infantry Division. As the force developed, it also included 2 South Korean Marine battalions, an elite Roka Infantry Regiment, and an assortment of support troops from the U.S. Army and Marine Corps. The entire force was designated the X-Corps and was placed under Ammen's command. The landing force became part of Joint Task Force 7, directed by Vice Admiral Arthur D. Struble, the U.S. Navy's 7th Fleet Commander. After a naval gun and aerial bombardment on September 14th, U.S. Marines assaulted Woolme Island the next day. Later that day, additional Marine units landed along Incheon's waterfront. The North Koreans' resistance was not stubborn, and their armored counterattacks over the next 2 days did little to slow the Marines' advance on Seoul. With Kimpo Airfield secured on September 18th, the 1st Marine Division put all 3 of its infantry regiments across the Han River on September 20-25. Then they captured Seoul with some last-minute and largely unnecessary help from a South Korean and a U.S. infantry regiment. Meanwhile, the 7th Infantry Division came ashore on September 18 and fanned out quickly to the south. On September 26th, the day Seoul fell to the Marines. An armored spearhead of the 8th Army dashing north from the Pusan perimeter met the 7th Infantry Division at Suwon, south of Seoul. The KPA, completely shattered, had ceased to exist as a cohesive force in the south. Many of its survivors were able to escape northward through the wild, rugged country in the central and eastern portion of the peninsula. But more than 125,000 prisoners fell into UNC hands. The amazement created by the sudden appearance of the X-Corps at Incheon added more luster to MacArthur's already brilliant career, and a landing is still considered to be one of the greatest operations in military history. Back to the 38th parallel. As UNC troops crossed the 38th parallel, Chinese Communist Party Chairman Mao Zedong received a plea for direct military aid from Kim Il-sung. The chairman was willing to intervene on behalf of North Korea, but he needed assurances of Soviet air power. Stalin promised to extend China's air defenses, manned by Soviets, to a corridor above the Yalu, thus protecting air bases in Manchuria and hydroelectric plants on the river. He also promised new Soviet weapons and armament factories. After much debate, Mao ordered the Runmin Zayuanjin, or Chinese People's Volunteers Force, CPVF, to cross into Korea. It was commanded by General Peng Dehuai, a veteran of 20 years of war against the Chinese nationalists and the Japanese. The Chinese first offensive, October 25, November 6, 1950, had the limited objective of testing U.S. ROK fighting qualities and slowing their advance. In the Battle of Anjong-un-San along the Changchon River, the Chinese ruined 7 Korean and U.S. regiments, including the only Korean regiment to reach the Yalu, cut off in the vastness of the cold northern hills near Seichosen. The Chinese suffered 10,000 casualties, but they were convinced that they had found a formula for fighting UNC forces: attack at night, cut off routes of supply, and withdrawal, ambush counterattacking forces, and exploit all forms of concealment and cover. stunned by the suddenness of the Chinese onslaught and almost 8,000 casualties, 6,000 of them Koreans. The 8th Army fell back to the south bank of the Cheongshan and tightened its overextended lines. With a harsh winter beginning and supplies in shortage, this pause in action was wise. Another matter of concern to the UNC was the appearance of MiG-15 jet fighters above North Korea, flown by Soviet pilots masquerading as Chinese and Koreans. The MiG stopped most of the daytime raids on North Korea in 1 week's action, November 1st to 7th. The U.S. Air Force immediately dispatched a crack wing of F-86 Sabre jet interceptors to Japan. Over the course of the war, the F-80SXS succeeded in allowing the Far East Air Forces, FEAF, to conduct offensive air operations anywhere in North Korea, and they also protected the 8th Army from communist air attack. However, they were never able to provide perfect protection for B-29's fly-ing daylight raids into MiG Alley, a corridor in northwestern Korea where MiGs based near Incheon, Manchuria, now Dandong, China, fiercely defended bridges and dams on the Yalu River. The FEF also turned its fury on all standing structures that might shield the Chinese from the cold. Cities and towns all over North Korea went up in flames. But the air assault did not halt the buildup for the Chinese second offensive. This time Peng's instructions to his army commanders stressed the necessity to lure the Americans and puppet troops out of their defensive positions between the Cheongshan and Pyongyang, giving the impression of weakness and confusion, while Peng would surround their forward elements with his much enlarged force of 420,000 Chinese and North Korean regulars. MacArthur, in what may have been his only real military mistake of the war, ordered the 8th Army and X-Corps northward into the trap on November 24th. And from November 25th to December 14th, the Chinese battered them back to South Korea, falling upon the U.S. 9 Corps and the ROK 2 Corps from the east. Peng's 13th Army Group opened up a gap to the west and almost cut off the I Corps north of the Cheongshan. The I Corps managed to fight its way through Chinese ambushes back to Pyongyang. In the eastern sector, the Chinese 9th Army Group sent 2 armies against the 1st Marine Division near the Chongjin Reservoir, known to the Americans by its Japanese name, Chosin. Under the worst possible weather conditions, the Marines turned and fought their way south, destroying 7 Chinese divisions. In focus, Battle of the Chosin Reservoir. Chosin was the name given on old Japanese military maps to the Chongjin Reservoir, a dammed lake in the Taebaek Mountains of North Korea. There, in December 1950, isolated and surrounded units of the 1st U.S. Marine Division and a regimental combat team of the 7th U.S. Infantry Division fought their way through 12 Chinese divisions until they reached waiting transport ships at the coast. Following the successful Incheon landing of September 1950, MacArthur ordered a general advance into North Korea. On the eastern side of the Korean peninsula's rocky spine, the 1st Marine Division, Major General Oliver Smith, commander, began to disembark at Wonsan on October 26th. On October 29th, the 7th Infantry Division landed farther north at I-1. In mid-November, the Marines and the 31st Regimental Combat Team, hastily assembled from units of the 7th Division, were ordered up to Chosin. The Marines were to take Udaman-I on the west side of the reservoir as the prelude of a stroke farther north against Kangi. And the 31st RCT was to relieve a Marine battalion on the east side of the reservoir and prepare to push toward the Yalu River at the border with China. Smith was extremely skeptical of these plans, and so he ordered the Marines to move cautiously northward, detaching forces to maintain their vital supply route to the ports in the Hungnam-Hamhung area, some 50 miles away. Unknown to the UNC, the Chinese 9th Army Group, comprising 12 divisions and 4 armies, was deployed along the eastern ridges of the Taibik Range. On the night of November 27th to 28th, the Chinese struck. They sent one army against the 31st RCT, 2 armies against the Marines at Udamanai and at Hagrari at the base of the reservoir, where Smith had his headquarters, and a 4th army against the road to Hungnam Deep in the rear. The 31st RCT was destroyed. Fewer than half of its original 2,500 troops managed to struggle on foot and in small, disorganized groups around the frozen reservoir or directly across the ice to Hagrari. There Smith consolidated his forces and had the dead and wounded flown out on transport planes that operated from a rudimentary airfield. On December 6th, spurning the idea of withdrawal or retreat and refusing to have his able-bodied troops airlifted out without their equipment, he faced his division southward toward Hungnam to begin attacking in another direction. Under weather conditions as cold as -20 degrees Fahrenheit, -29 degrees Celsius, the 1st Marine Division, along with the remnants of the 31st RDC, a commando of Royal Marines and attached South Korean troops, fought its way out against constant Chinese attack. Smith's forces retraced their route from the coast down a single narrow, vulnerable road through several mountain passes and bridge chasms. The Chinese, suffering as much as the Americans from the cold and subjected during daylight hours to attack by U.S. Air Force and Marine Corps planes, were unable to halt the Marines' steady advance. On December 11th, the 1st Marine Division reached Hungnam, whence it was evacuated by sea. Of the almost 12,000 Marines who began the breakout from Hagrari, 178 were killed, 749 were wounded, and 23 were missing in action. In addition, there were some 1,500 non-battle casualties, a large number of them from frostbite. The Battle of the Chosin Reservoir quickly became one of the most storied exploits in Marine Corps history. However, for the American participants, the brilliance of the breakout could not completely dispel the gloom of defeat. Before reaching sanctuary at the port of Hungnam on December 11th, at the height of the crisis, MacArthur conferred with Walker and Amund, and they agreed that their forces would try to establish enclaves in North Korea, thus preserving the option of holding the Pyongyang-Wonsan line. In reality, Walker had finally reached the limits of his disgust with MacArthur's meddling and posturing, and he started his men south. By December 6th, the 8th Army had destroyed everything it could not carry and had taken a road for Seoul. Walker's initiative may have saved his army, but it also meant that much of the rest of the war would be fought as a UNC effort to recapture Ground Sur, rendered with little effort in December 1950. Walker himself died in a traffic accident just north of Seoul on December 23rd and was C'd by Lieutenant General Matthew B. Ridgway. Heartened by the ease with which the CPVF had driven the UNC out of North Korea, Mao Zedong expanded his war aims to demand that the Chinese Army unify all of Korea, and Chinese Third Offensive December 31, 1950, January 5, 1951, retook Seoul. The Chinese attacks centered on Rokka-Devi science, which were showing signs of defeatism and ineptness. Ridgway, drive the Americans and pets off the peninsula. His enthusiasm increased when Lieutenant General Walton H. Walker, front left, consults with General Douglas MacArthur, front right, November 1950. Carl Maiden's /time and life pictures /Getty Images. therefore, had to rely in the short term upon his U.S. divisions, many of which had now gained units from other UN participants. In addition to 2 British Commonwealth brigades, there were units from Turkey, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Greece, Colombia, Thailand, Ethiopia, and the Philippines, pulling his multinational force together. Ridgway pushed back to the Han River Valley in January 1951. The Chinese, now reinforced by a reborn North Korean army, launched their 4th offensive on February 11, 1951. Again, the initial attacks struck ill-prepared South Korean divisions, and again the UNC gave ground. Again, the 8th Army fought back methodically, crossing the 38th parallel after 2 months. At that point, Peng began the 5th offensive, first phase, with 11 Chinese armies and 2 North Korean corps. The attacks came in an awkward moment for the 8th Army. On April 11th, Truman reached the opinion that MacArthur's independence amounted to insubordination, had relieved the general of all his commands and recalled him to the United States. The change elevated Ridgway to commander-in-chief of both FECM and the UNC and brought Lieutenant General James A. Van Fleet to command the 8th Army. Like Ridgway, Van Fleet had earned wide respect as a division and corps commander during World War II against the Germans in 1944-45. Before Van Fleet could reform the ROK Army and redeploy his own DV, the Chinese struck. At a low point in Korean military history, the battered Roka II Corps gave way. The U.S. DV then peeled back to protect their flanks and rear until Van Fleet could commit 5 more U.S. and Korean DV and a British brigade to halt the Chinese armies on April 28th. Mao refused to accept Peng's report that the CPVF could no longer hold the initiative, and he ordered the 2nd phase of the offensive, which began on May 16th and lasted another bloody week. Once again, Allied air power and heavy artillery stiffened the resistance. And once again, the UNC crossed the 38th parallel in pursuit of a battered, but not beaten, Chinese expeditionary force. Primary document, Harry S. Truman's Korea and the Policy of Containment speech. The differences between MacArthur and the Truman administration over Korean war policy intensified during the spring of 1951, when the UNC, made up mostly of Americans, faced upwards of 400,000 Red Chinese volunteers, in addition to the well-trained and Soviet-equipped divisions of North Korea. While MacArthur wanted an all-out war, including permission to bomb bases in China, the administration was determined to confine the war to Korea and to end it if possible with a negotiated settlement. After removing MacArthur from his command, Truman broadcast a message to the nation, excerpted below on April 11th, defining the government's aims in Korea and explaining MacArthur's recall. Bulletin, April 16, 1951, pages 603 to 605. I want to talk plainly to you tonight about what we're doing in Korea and about our policy in the Far East. In the simplest terms, what we're doing in Korea is this. We're trying to prevent a third world war. The aggression against Korea is the boldest and most dangerous move the communists have yet made. The attack on Korea was part of a greater plan for conquering all of Asia. The question we have had to face is whether the communist plan of conquest can be stopped without general war. Our government and other countries associated with us in the United Nations believe that the best chance of stopping it without general war is to meet the attack in Korea and defeat it there. That is what we have been doing. It is a difficult and bitter task, but so far it has been successful. So far, we have prevented World War III. So far, by fighting a limited war in Korea, We have prevented aggression from succeeding and bringing on a general war. And the ability of the whole free world to resist communist aggression has been greatly improved. I have thought long and hard about this question of extending the war in Asia. I have discussed it many times with the ablest military advisors in the country. I believe with all my heart that the course we are following is the best course. I believe that we must try to limit the war to Korea for these vital reasons. To make sure that the precious lives of our fighting men are not wasted. To see that the security of our country and the free world is not needlessly jeopardized, and to prevent a third world war. A number of events have made it evident that General MacArthur did not agree with that policy. I have therefore considered it essential to relieve General MacArthur so that there would be no doubt or confusion as to the real purpose and aim of our policy. It was with the deepest personal regret that I found myself compelled to take this action. General MacArthur is one of our greatest military commanders. But the cause of world peace is more important than any individual. We are ready at any time to negotiate for a restoration of peace in the area. But we will not engage in appeasement. We are only interested in real peace. Real peace can be achieved through a settlement based on the following factors. The fighting must stop. Concrete steps must be taken to ensure that the fighting will not break out again. There must be an end to the aggression. A settlement founded upon these elements would open the way for the unification of Korea and the withdrawal of all foreign forces. We do not want to widen the conflict. We will use every effort to prevent that disaster. And in so doing, we know that we are following the great principles of peace, freedom, and justice. To the negotiating table. By June 1951, the Korean War had reached another critical point. The Chinese, North Korean armies, despite having suffered some 500,000 casualties since November, had grown to 1,200,000 soldiers. The UNC had taken its share of casualties, more than 100,000 since the Chinese intervention, but by May 1950, U.S. ground troops numbered 256,000. The ROKA, 500,000, and other Allied contingents 28,000. The U.S. FEAF had grown from fewer than 700 aircraft in July 1950 to more than 1,400 in February 1951. These developments obliged the leaders of both coalitions to consider that peace could not be imposed by either side through military victory, at least at acceptable cost. Truman and the UN, in particular, had lost their ardor for anything more than a return to status quo antebellum, and were sympathetic to the idea of a negotiated settlement. On May 17, 1951, the U.S. National Security Council adopted a new policy that committed the United States to support a unified, democratic Korea, but not necessarily one unified by military action and the overthrow of Kim Il-sung. The communist road to a negotiated peace started in Beijing, where Mao, who had no desire to end the war, approved an approach suggested by Peng and others. Hold the ground in Korea and conduct a campaign of attrition, attempting to win limited victories against small Allied units through violent night attacks and infantry infiltration. Protection from UNC aircraft and artillery would be provided by caves and bunkers dug into the Korean mountains. Meanwhile, negotiations would be managed by the Chinese. An unparalleled chance to appear an equal of the United States in Asia and a slap at the hated Japanese. The Koreans were not a factor for either side. After secret meetings between U.S. and Soviet diplomats, the Soviet Union announced that it would not block a negotiated settlement to the Korean War. The Truman administration had already alerted Ridgway to the prospect of truce talks. And on June 30th, he issued a public statement that he had been authorized to participate in a meeting to discuss an armistice providing for the cessation of hostilities. On July 2nd, the Chinese and North Koreans issued a joint statement that they would discuss arrangements for a meeting, but only at their place of choice, the city of Kaesong, an ancient Korean capital, once part of the ROK, but now occupied by the communists at the very edge of the front lines. The Chinese had just fired the first salvo of a new war, one in which talking and fighting for advantage might someday end the conflict. Talking and fighting, 1951 to 53, battling for position. From the time the liaison officers of both coalitions met on July 8, 1951, until the armistice agreement was signed on July 27, 1953. The Korean War continued as. In focus, Kaesong. Kaesong lies just south of latitude 38 degrees north, the 38th parallel, approximately 45 miles, 72 kilometers, north, west of Seoul, S.Corp. One of the oldest cities of Korea, Kaesong was the capital of the Goryeo dynasty, 935 to 1392. It was formerly called Songdo, City of Pine, so named because it is surrounded by pine-covered mountains, including Mount Songgak, 2,506 feet or 764 meters, and Osong, 3,483 feet or 1,062 meters. Kaesong is a castle city enclosed by a stone wall with 4 gates. It was overrun by communist forces during the war, and in 1951 it was chosen as the site of the first truce talks. After the war, Kaesong was included in North Korea. The area is home to the Kaesong Industrial Complex, an industrial park and duty-free trade facility established as a joint venture between the North and South Korean governments to allow South Korean companies to manufacture goods in the North. Financed and managed for the most part by South Korea, it was planned during a period of warming North-South relations in the late 1990s, and construction began in 2003. Within a few years, several dozen South Korean companies had facilities there, among them textile, chemical, machinery, and electronics factories. The Busi, Nesses employed both North and South Koreans. Tourist groups were permitted to visit the complex from South Korea by means of a road built from the latter. Although some of the city's Goryeo-era monuments were destroyed during the war, many pleas, tombs, and palaces remain, including some that have been restored. The medicinal herb ginseng is a famous product of the area that has been exported to China and Southeast Asian countries since ancient times. Kaesong is also a notable cultural and educational center. A stalemate. This characterization is appropriate in only 2 ways. 1. Both sides had given up trying to unify Korea by force. And 2. The movement of armies on the ground never again matched the fluidity of the war's first year. Otherwise, the word stalemate has no meaning. For the political geographic stakes in Korea remain high. As the negotiations at Kaesong Devil, op-ed, neither Ridgway nor Van Fleet believed that the talks would produce anything without more UNC offensives beyond the 38th parallel. Ridgway was particularly convinced that UNC forces should take the Iron Triangle, a key area between the headwaters of the Imjin River and the highest eastern mountain ranges that was anchored on the cities of Sichuan, west, Pyongyang, north, and Kimhwa, east. Communist planners were equally convinced that control of this terrain offered advantages for defend North Korea, or for continuing the war with offensives to the south and east. Ground actions never actually ceased in 1951, but none matched the ferocity and frustration of the 8th Army's autumn offensive, August 31, November 12. Van Fleet's General Concept NV, Sionate operations by the I Corps, 5 divisions, in the West, and the X Corps, 5 divisions, in the Central Eastern SEC Tour. In the I Corps sector, the ROK 1st Division and the British Commonwealth Division made notable advances beyond the Imjin Valley, while other U.S. and ROK divisions advanced past Chor and then stalled in heavy fighting. The X Corps, fighting a cracked Chinese army and 2 North Korean corps, pushed north, warred through the mountains, and succeeded only in making Bloody Ridge, Heartbreak Ridge, the Punch Bowl, and Kamibong Ridge bad memories for thousands of Army and Marine veterans. The KPA I, 3, and 6 Corps, holding the Eastern Mountains, proved especially difficult to dislodge. For Kim Il-sung had issued a stand or die order to his much enlarged and improved armed forces. The most surprising advance occurred in the X-Corps sector, where 2 U.S. and 2 ROK divisions pushed the Chinese back almost 10 miles, 16 kilometers, from Kim Hwa to Kumsong. Push ING the front line out in a salient that exposed their flanks, but also establishing a strong position to advance west to Pyongyang. The cost of the campaign troubled Van Fleet and Ridgway, with 60,000 casualties and 22,000 of them American soldiers. The campaign did not discourage the Chinese leadership, since in their eyes the strategy of active defense had worked. The UNC gave up major offensive operations in November, and the Chinese actually struck back in places with some success. Communist losses of some 100,000 to 150,000 were significant, but not crippling. Certainly not enough to drive the Chinese to end the war, only to talk some more about it. In late October 1951, the Communists agreed to move the truce negotiations to a more secure area, a village named Panmunjom. Within 2 months, they accepted the current line of contact between the armies as the Military Damar, Cat Iron Line. They also accepted related measures for the creation of a demilitarized zone. The UNC accepted that there would be no verification activities outside of the DMZ, and both sides agreed to work on a regime for enforcement of the armistice after the shooting stopped. Much work on these items remained to be done, but the outline of an agreement was becoming apparent as the year ended. However, there was one major exception to the accordance reached between the North and South: how each side would handle their prisoners of war, battling over POWs. As another bitterly cold Korean winter congealed operations on the ground, repatriation of prisoners of war, POWs, became the most intractable issue at Panmunjom. The initial assumption of the negotiators was that they would follow the revised Geneva Convention of 1949, which required any detaining authority that held POWs to return all of them to their homelands as rapidly as possible when a war ended. This all for, in focus, Panmunjom. Panmunjom is a village in the demilitarized zone of Central Korea, established after the Korean War, 5 miles, 8 kilometers, east of Kaesong and 3 miles, 5 kilometers, south of the 38th parallel, on the Gyeongui High Road from Seoul to Sinuiju. It was the location of the truce conference that was held for 2 years, 1951 to 53, between representatives of the United Nations forces and the opposing North Korean and Chinese armies during the war. After the armistice, signed there July 27, 1953, both the liaison officers and the guards of the 4 countries forming the Neutral Nations Supervisory Commission, Sweden, Switzerland, Poland, and Czechoslovakia, were located there. In 1968, the U.S. intelligence ship Pueblo was seized off the North Korean coast by North Korean patrol boats, and its officers and crew were incarcerated and charged with espionage. Panmunjom was then used as the negotiation site between the United States and North Korea, and the crew were released through the village. Subsequently, it has served as a meeting place for conferences between North and South Korea, including Red Cross conferences to establish means of communication and contact between people on either side of the truce line. All policy of a complete, even forced, exchange of prisoners was certainly favored by the U.S. military, which was alarmed by early reports from Korea of atrocities against Allied POWs. The South Korean government, on the other hand, was adamantly opposed to complete and involuntary repatriation, since it knew that thousands of detainees in the South were actually South Korean citizens who had been forced to fight with the KPA. Indeed, the North Koreans knew that they had much to answer for regarding their impressment, murder, and kidnapping of South Koreans. The Chinese army lead, Ayers, meanwhile, knew that some of their soldiers, impressed from the ranks of the Nationalist Army, would refuse repatria, tie-in if it was not made mandatory. Both sides agreed to exchange the names of POWs and the numbers held in various categories. The results of the tally shocked all the participants. The U.S. Armed Forces were carrying 500 men as missing in action, MIA, but the Communists reported only 3,198 Americans in their custody, as well as 1,219 other UNC POWs, mostly Britons and Turks. The accounting for the South Koreans was even worse. Of an estimated 88,000 MIAs, only 7,142 names were listed. The number bears fed the fears of the Allies that the murder rate of POWs had been even worse than they suspected. In truth, most of the MIAs had died in battle, but perhaps 15,000, all but 2,000 of them South Koreans, had died in communist hands from torture, execution, starvation, and medical mistreatment. The communists, too, found little comfort in the numbers. Early unofficial estimates of POWs in UNC custody had been either too low, around 90,000, or too high, around 170,000. Now the official list produced 95,531 North Koreans, 20,700 Chinese, and 16,243 South Koreans, for a total of 132,474. The UNC reported that the 40,000 missing men were South Koreans who had already passed loyalty investigations and would not be counted as potential repatriates. Against this background, Truman ruled in January 1952 that no POW in UNC custody will be forced to return to North Korea or China against his will. Koreans choosing to go north would be exchanged on a one-for-one formula until all 12,000 Allied POWs had been returned. Such a process, however, would require extensive screening of individuals about their preferences, a condition that soon aided open warfare in the camps. The Communists had taken steps in 1951 to infiltrate political officers into the UNC POW camps, and now orders came from Pyongyang to obstruct the screening process without regard for loss of life. The goal was to make the POWs so obnoxious that the UNC would use force if necessary to send every one of them back to communist control. And so, beginning in December 1951, a series of revolts broke out inside the wire, culminating in pitched battles between armed prisoners and entire guard battalions, in which hundreds of POWs and a small number of UNC troops lost their lives. Finally, in May 1952, Mark W. Clark, who had just replaced Ridgway as UNC commander, ordered the execution of Operation Breakup, which over the following months crushed the revolt with tanks, gas, and bullets. By the end of the year, all the Chinese have been sent to Jeju Island. Repatriate and non-repatriate POWs segregated. Refugees resettled. Some of the communist intel intelligence network disrupted. And camp administration improved. Vigilantism and gang warfare never ceased entirely. However, guerrilla warfare, the POW revolt, was only one aspect of the other war raging behind UNC lines. Another was waged by Communist Party, SANS, and stay-behind units of the KPA, who, based in South Korea's mountainous southern provinces, plagued the UNC lines of communication, rear area camps, and Korean towns. In the autumn of 1951, Van Fleet ordered Major General Paik's son, one of the ROKA's most effective officers, to break the back of guerrilla activity. From December 1951 to March 1952, ROK security forces killed 11,090 partisans and sympathizers and captured 916 more, a ratio suggesting some thing close to a scorched earth, no quarter policy. Previous ROKA counter-guerrilla operations had resulted in the war's worst atrocity by a UNC unit, the execution of 800 to 1,000 villagers at Kokong in February 1951. Air warfare. Air power gave a UNC its greatest hope to offset Chinese manpower and increasing firepower. The FEF clearly won the battle for air superiority, pitting fewer than 100 F-80SXS against far more numerous Soviet, Chinese, and North Korean MiG-15s. Pilots from all the U.S. Armed Forces downed at least 500 MiGs at a loss of 78 F-80SXS. The Soviets rotated squadrons of their air defense force to Korea, losing more than 200 pilots. Strategic bombing by the UNC was at first limited by policy to attacks on North Korean cities and military installations. A campaign pursued until Pyongyang resembled Hiroshima or Tokyo in 1945. In focus, MiG-15 and F-86 Sabres. In December 1950, U.S. pilots flying F-86 Sabres and Soviet pilots flying MiG-15s over North Korea began history's first large-scale jet fighter combat. The appearance of Soviet pilots marked a major turning point in the war. One of China's conditions for entering the war in October 1950 was Soviet air support. And to that end, Soviet fighter units were sent to bases in Manchuria, close to the border with North Korea. The aircraft bore Chinese markings, and the pilots were ordered to speak only Chinese or Korean, but to the crews of US B-29 bombers and their escort fighters. There was no doubt as to the pilot's nationality, a nationality that was eventually confirmed when the Soviet pilots, in the pressure of combat, abandoned the ruse and communicated by radio in Russian. The MiG-15 was the first all-new Soviet jet aircraft, one whose design did not simply add a jet engine onto an older piston engine airframe. Employing swept-back wings, tail fin, and horizontal stabilizers to reduce drag as the plane approached the speed of sound. It clearly exploited aerodynamic principles learned from German engineering at the close of World War II. It was powered by a centrifugal flow engine that had been licensed from the British Rolls-Royce Company and then upgraded by the Soviet manufacturer Klimov. The plane was first flown in 1947, and deliveries to frontline fighter units began in 1949. Designed as a bomber interceptor, the MiG-15 carried a 4Me stable armament of two 23mm guns and one 37mm gun firing exploding shells. Shocked by the speed, climbing ability, and high operating ceiling of the Soviet fighter, the United States hurried delivery to Korea of the new F-86 Sabre, a single-seat, single-engine jet fighter built by North American Aviation Incorporated. Like the MiG-15, the F-86 was built with swept-back wings, was first flown in 1947, and became operational in 1949. Unlike its Soviet counterpart, it was designed for air superiority combat with other jet fighters. It was powered by a General Electric turbojet engine, and its armament consisted of 6 50-inch machine guns, though later versions also carried 20mm cannons. Though inferior to the MiG-15 in weight of armament, turn radius, and maximum speed at combat altitude. The F-86 quickly re-established U.S. air supremacy over Korea, in part because of its superior handling characteristics, a radar-ranging gun sight, and a superior pilot training system instituted by the U.S. Air Force. Nevertheless, the MiG-15 virtually ended daylight bombing runs by the huge, slow B-29s, and Soviet pilots continued to engage in combat with U.S. and Allied planes even as they trained Chinese and North Koreans to fly in the new jet age. In 1952, the bombing of power plants and dams along the Yalu also was authorized, and the following year approval was given to attack dams and supporting irrigation systems in North Korea. The bombing caused great suffering for the North Koreans, but they had to follow the Chinese and Russians in the war's straight GIC direction, and the Chinese and Russians were hurt very little. Throughout the war, U.S. political and military leaders studied the possible use of nuclear weapons, and upon foreseeing rare occasions they gave this study serious attention. The answer was always the same: existing atomic bombs, carried by modified B-29s, would have little effect, except for leveling cities. The one time that Truman suggested, in December 1950, that he was considering the nuclear option, the British led the Allied charge to stop such talk. Without question, the UNC air campaign hurt the Communists, and in retaliation, the Chinese and North Koreans, with Soviet collusion, treated captured pilots with special brutality. Air crewmen made up the largest single group of U.S. POWs who truly disappeared without a trace, presumably dying under an Iroga, Taiwan in Manchuria, elsewhere in China, and possibly in Russia. The Communists also claimed that FEF bombers were spreading epidemic diseases among the U.S. Air Force mechanics prepare F-86 Sabres for combat at the Suwon Air Base in South Korea. F-80SXS were used by the Far East Air Forces, FEAF, throughout the Korean War. U.S. Air Force photo. Civilian population, and they tortured captured American pilots until they extracted incriminating statements of terror bombing and germ warfare, strengthening the ROK. U.S. air power might have held the Communists at bay in the near term, but the long-term security of the ROK depended on 1. The enlargement and improvement of its own armed forces, and 2. The stability of its government. The first requirement was accomplished by the United States Korean Military Advisory Group, which modernized the ROKA and also organized an effective training program. In the political arena, however, the UNC had to deal with the aging Ri, who was convinced that he had an unfinished divine mission to save Korea. In 1952, Ri forced the National Assembly to make the election of the president a matter of popular vote, immediately calling an election and winning a second term with 5 million of the 6 million votes cast. Ri's political coup had a ripple effect that spread to the armistice negotiations, as his dogmatic opposition to a ceasefire increased in scope and vigor. Essentially, Ri could not believe that a likely new Republican administration in Washington, led by 2 other venerable Cold Warriors, Dwight D. Eisenhower and John Foster Dulles, would be satisfied to have U.S. soldiers die for a tie. Neither could the Russians, Chinese, and North Koreans. The final push. From September to November 1952, the Chinese Expeditionary Force staged its sixth major offensive of the war, this time to force the Allies back to the 38th parallel and to inflict unacceptable casualties on them, raging from the valley of the Imjin through the Iron Triangle to the Eastern Mountains. The ground war followed the same dismal pattern. The Chinese infill trot-head Allied outposts at night, then attacked under the support of short, intense artillery barges. Submachine guns and hand grenades ruled the trenches, and flamethrowers and demoli. Tines became standard weapons for assault units. Obscure hills acquired memorable names. Whitehorse Mountain, Bunker Hill, Old Baldy, Sniper Ridge, Capitol Hill, Triangle Hill, Pikes Peak, Jackson Heights, and Jane Russell Hill. By the time fighting faded in mid-November, the 8th Army had lost 10,000 men, the Chinese 15,000. Chinese commanders hoped that they had persuaded President-elect Eisenhower to abandon any ambitious plans for a major offensive in 1953. The Chinese need not have worried. For both Eisenhower and Secretary of State-designate Dulles viewed continua, tie into the Korean War as incompatible with U.S. national security interests. In their view, the People's Republic of China was indeed the enemy in Asia, but Korea was only one theater in the struggle. They also knew that the voting public's support 46. The Korean War and the Vietnam War. People, politics, and power. President Dwight D. Eisenhower, right, meets with his Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, left, September 1954. Carl Iwasaki, /Time and Life Pictures /Getty Images. For the war had thinned throughout 1952 as the talking and fighting continued abroad and the talking and taxing content yet at home. As for the negotiations, Dulles conceded the communist point that voluntary repatriation should involve screening by an international agency, not just USROK teams. When the UN and the International Committee of the Red Cross called for an exchange of sick and disabled POWs as a goodwill gesture, Eisenhower approved. The plan proved a good test of calm, munist intentions by sheer chance. On March 5, 1953, Joseph Stalin died. And within weeks, the Politburo of the Soviet Communist Party voted that the war in Korea should be ended. Mao Zedong received the news with dismay, but he knew that his army could not continue the war without Soviet assistance, with a speed that amazed the negotiating teams on both sides. The Chinese accepted voluntary repatriation. POWs who wanted to return to their homelands would be released immediately, and those who chose to stay would go into the custody of a neutral international agency for non-coercive screening. The Chinese and North Koreans also agreed to the exchange of sick and disabled POWs, which took place between April 20th and May 3rd. Peace was not yet at hand, however. Rhee had never publicly surrendered his march north and unify position, and in private he hinted that he might accept an armistice only in return for serious commitments by the United States, including an unambiguous mutual SECU, righty alliance, and $1 billion in economic aid. The Chinese, meanwhile, saw but one way to win concessions and territory in a peace agreement. On the battlefield, their seventh and final offensive opened in the Imjin River sector in May against U.S. and Commonwealth divisions. Then, primary document, Dwight D. Eisenhower's "I shall go to Korea" speech. Eisenhower would probably have won in any event, but his election was assured when, in a campaign speech at Detroit on October 24, 1952, he pledged to go to Korea immediately after Election Day if he were chosen as America's next president. He did win, and he did go to Korea on December 2nd. The Detroit speech is excerpted below. New York Times, October 25th, 1952. In this anxious autumn for America, one fact looms above all others in our people's mind. One tragedy challenges all men dedicated to the work of peace. One word shouts denial to those who foolishly pretend that ours is not a nation at war. This fact is tragedy. This word is Korea. A small country, Korea has been for more than 2 years. The battleground for the costliest foreign war our nation has fought, excepting the 2 world wars. It has been the burial ground for 20,000 American dead. It has been another historic field of honor for the valor and skill and tenac, ity of American soldiers. All these things it has been, and yet one thing more. It has been a symbol, a telling symbol of the foreign policy of our nation. It has been a sign, a warning sign, of the way the administration has conducted our world affairs. It has been a measure, a damning measure, of the quality of leadership we have been given. The biggest fact about the Korean War is this. It was never inevitable. It was never inescapable. No fantastic fiat of history decreed that little South Korea, in the summer of 1950, would fatally tempt communist aggressors as their easiest victim. No demonic destiny decreed that America had to be bled this way in order to keep South Korea free and to keep freedom itself self-respecting. The record of failure dates back, with red-letter folly, at least to September of 1947. It was then that Gen. Albert Wiedemeyer, returned from a presidential mission to the Far East, submitted to the president this warning. The withdrawal of American military forces from Korea would result in the occupation of South Korea by either Soviet troops or, as seems more likely, by the Korean military units trained under Soviet auspices in North Korea. That warning and his entire report were disregarded and suppressed by the administration. When the enemy struck on that June day of 1950, what did America do? It did what it always has done in all its times of peril. It appealed to the heroism of its youth. This appeal was utterly right and utterly inescapable. It was inescapable not only because this was the only way to defend the idea of collective freedom against savage aggression. That appeal was inescapable because there was now in the plight into which we had stumbled no other way to save honor and self-respect. The answer to that appeal has been what any American knew it would be. It has been sheer valor. Valor on all the Korean mountainsides that each day bear fresh scars of new graves. Now, in this anxious autumn, from these heroic men, there comes back an answering appeal. It is no whine, no whimpering plea. It is a question that addresses itself to simple reason. It asks, where do we go from here? When comes the end? Is there an end? My answer, candid and complete, is this. The first task of a new administration will be to review and re-examine every course of action open to us with one goal in view, to bring the Korean War to an early and honorable end. That is my pledge to the American people. For this task, a wholly new administration is necessary. The reason for this is simple. The old administration cannot be expected to repair what it failed to prevent. Where will a new administration begin? It will begin with its president taking a simple, firm resolution. That resolution will be to forego the diversions of politics and to concentrate on the job of ending the Korean War until that job is honorably done. That job requires a personal trip to Korea. I shall make that trip. Only in that way could I learn how best to serve the American people in the cause of peace. Shifted to the South Koreans, who were driven back about 19 miles from the Kumsong salient. Armistice. The Battle of the Kumsong salient ended the shooting war. On May 25th, the Panmunjom negotiators had worked out the details of the POW exchange, ing provisions for neutral nation management of the repatriation process. They began to plan for an armistice sign, ing. Then, on June 18th to 19th, rearranged for his military police to allow 27,000 Korean internees in their custody to escape. Enraged, the Chinese ordered further attacks on the Roca. The Americans shared their fury, but, in the interest of compromise, convinced Rhee that the United States would meet all his preconditions for an armistice. On July 9th, Rhee agreed to accept the armistice, though no representative of the ROK ever signed it. On July 27th, Mark W. Clark for the UNC, Peng Dehuai for the Chinese, and Kim Il-sung for the North Koreans signed the agreement. That same day, the shooting stopped, more or less, and the armies began the awkward process of disengagement across what became a 2.5-mile wide DMZ. Supervision of the armistice actions fell to a military armistice commission. North Korean prisoners of war leaving a prison camp on Koja Island, South Korea, en route to Incheon as a condition of North-South armistice, August 1953. Central Press /Holton Archive /Getty Images. For the war had thinned throughout 1952 as the talking and fighting continued abroad and the talking and taxing content yet at home. As for the negotiations, Dulles conceded the communist point that voluntary repatriation should involve screening by an international agency, not just U.S. ROK teams. When the UN and the International Committee of the Red Cross called for an exchange of sick and disabled POWs as a goodwill gesture, Eisenhower approved. The plan proved a good test of calm, munist intentions by sheer chance. On March 5, 1953, Joseph Stalin died. And within weeks, the Politburo of the Soviet Communist Party voted that the war in Korea should be ended. Mao Zedong received the news with dismay, but he knew that his army could not continue the war without Soviet assistance, with a speed that amazed the negotiating teams on both sides. The Chinese accepted voluntary repatriation. POWs who wanted to return to their homelands would be released immediately, and those who chose to stay would go into the custody of a neutral international agency for NONCO screening. The Chinese and North Koreans also agreed to the exchange of sick and disabled POWs, which took place between April 20th and May 3rd. Peace was not yet at hand, however. Rhee had never publicly surrendered his March North and Unify position, and in private he hinted that he might accept an armistice only in return for serious commitments by the United States, including an unambiguous mutual SECU, Righty Alliance, and $1 billion in economic aid. The Chinese, meanwhile, saw but one way to win concessions and territory in a peace agreement. On the battlefield, their seventh and final offensive opened in the Imjin River sector in May against U.S. and Commonwealth divisions. Then, primary document, Dwight D. Eisenhower's "I shall go to Korea" speech. Eisenhower would probably have won in any event, but his election was assured when, in a campaign speech at Detroit on October 24, 1952, he pledged to go to Korea immediately after Election Day if he were chosen as America's next president. He did win, and he did go to Korea on December 2nd. The Detroit speech is excerpted below. New York Times, October 25, 1952. In this anxious autumn for America, one fact looms above all others in our people's mind. One tragedy challenges all men dedicated to the work of peace. One word shouts denial to those who foolishly pretend that ours is not a nation at war. This fact is tragedy. This word is Korea. A small country, Korea has been for more than 2 years. The battleground for the costliest foreign war our nation has fought, excepting the 2 world wars. It has been the burial ground for 20,000 American dead. It has been another historic field of honor for the valor and skill and tenac, ity of American soldiers. All these things it has been, and yet one thing more. It has been a symbol, a telling symbol of the foreign policy of our nation. It has been a sign, a warning sign, of the way the administration has conducted our world affairs. It has been a measure, a damning measure, of the quality of leadership we have been given. The biggest fact about the Korean War is this. It was never inevitable. It was never inescapable. No fantastic fiat of history decreed that little South Korea, in the summer of 1950, would fatally tempt communist aggressors as their easiest victim. No demonic destiny decreed that America had to be bled this way in order to keep South Korea free and to keep freedom itself self-respecting. The record of failure dates back, with red-letter folly, at least to September of 1947. It was then that Gen. Albert Wiedemeyer, returned from a presidential mission to the Far East, submitted to the president this warning. The withdrawal of American military forces from Korea would result in the occupation of South Korea by either Soviet troops or, as seems more likely, by the Korean military units trained under Soviet auspices in North Korea. That warning and his entire report were disregarded and suppressed by the administration. When the enemy struck on that June day of 1950, what did America do? It did what it always has done in all its times of peril. It appealed to the heroism of its youth. This appeal was utterly right and utterly inescapable. It was inescapable not only because this was the only way to defend the idea of collective freedom against savage aggression. That appeal was inescapable because there was now in the plight into which we had stumbled no other way to save honor and self-respect. The answer to that appeal has been what any American knew it would be. It has been sheer valor. Valor on all the Korean mountainsides that each day bear fresh scars of new graves. Now, in this anxious autumn, from these heroic men there comes back an answering appeal. It is no whine, no whimpering plea. It is a question that addresses itself to simple reason. It asks, where do we go from here? When comes the end? Is there an end? My answer, candid and complete, is this. The first task of a new administration will be to review and re-examine every course of action open to us with one goal in view, to bring the Korean War to an early and honorable end. That is my pledge to the American people. For this task, a wholly new administration is necessary. The reason for this is simple. The old administration cannot be expected to repair what it failed to prevent. Where will a new administration begin? It will begin with its president taking a simple, firm resolution. That resolution will be to forego the diversions of politics and to concentrate on the job of ending the Korean War until that job is honorably done. That job requires a personal trip to Korea. I shall make that trip. Only in that way could I learn how best to serve the American people in the cause of peace. Shifted to the South Koreans, who were driven back about 19 miles from the Kumsong salient. Armistice. The Battle of the Kumsong salient ended the shooting war. On May 25th, the Panmunjom negotiators had worked out the details of the POW exchange, MAC, ING provisions for neutral nation management of the repatriation process. They began to plan for an armistice sign, ING. Then, on June 18th to 19th, rearranged for his military police to allow 27,000 Korean internees in their custody to escape. Enraged, the Chinese ordered further attacks on the Roca. The Americans shared their fury, but in the interest of compromise, convinced Rhee that the United States would meet all his preconditions for an armistice. On July 9th, Rhee agreed to accept the armistice, though no representative of the ROK ever signed it. On July 27th, Mark W. Clark for the UNC, Peng Dehuai for the Chinese, and Kim Il-sung for the North Koreans signed the agreement. That same day, the shooting stopped, more or less, and the armies began the awkward process of disengagement across what became a 2.5-mile wide DMZ. Supervision of the armistice actions fell to a military armistice commission. North Korean prisoners of war leaving a prison camp on Koja Island, South Korea, en route to Incheon as a condition of North-South armistice, August 1953. Central Press /Holton Archive /Getty Images. 10 officers representing the belligerents. A neutral nation's supervisory commission, Sweden, Switzerland, Poland, and Czechoslovakia, and a neutral nation's repatriation commission, the same 4 states, plus India as the custodian of the POWs. From August 5th to September 6th, a total of 75. 823 communist soldiers and civilians, all but 5,640 of them Koreans, returned to their most favored regime, and 7,862 ROK soldiers, 3,597 U.S. servicemen, and 377 persons of other nationalities, including some civilians, returned to UNC control. The swap became a media event of potent possibilities. The communist POWs stripped off their hated capitalist prison uniforms and marched off singing party-approved songs. The handling of those who refused repatriation turned into a nightmare, as agents among the communist POWs and interrogators made life miserable for the Indians. By the time the neutral nation's repatriation commission gave up the screening process in February 1954, only 628 Chinese and Koreans had changed their minds and gone north, and 21,839 had returned to UNC control. Most of the non-repatriates were eventually settled in South Korea and Taiwan. In focus, Demilitarized Zone, DMZ. The Demilitarized Zone, DMZ, on the Korean peninsula demarcates North Korea from South Korea. It roughly follows latitude 38 degrees north, the 38th parallel. The original demarcation line between North Korea and South Korea at the end of World War II. The DMZ incorporates territory on both sides of the ceasefire line as it existed at the end of the Korean War, 1950 to 53, and was created by pulling back the respective forces 2 miles, 2 kilometers along each side of the line. It runs for about 150 miles, 241 kilometers, across the peninsula, from the mouth of the Han River on the west coast to a little south of the North Korean town of Kosong on the east coast. Located within the DMZ is the truce village of Panmunjom, about 5 miles, 8 kilometers, east of Kaesong and Angkor. It was the site of peace discussions during the Korean War and has since been the location of various conferences over issues related to North and South Korea, their allies, and the United Nations. The areas north and south of the DMZ are heavily fortified, and both sides maintain large contingents of troops there. Over the years, there have been occasional incidents and minor skirmishes, but no significant conflicts. Once farmland and subsequently a devastated battleground, the DMZ has lain almost untouched since the end of hostilities and has reverted to nature to a large extent, making it one of the most pristine, undeveloped areas in Asia. The zone contains many ecosystems including forests, estuaries, and wetlands frequented by migratory birds. It serves as a sanctuary for hundreds of bird species. among them the endangered white-naped and red-crowned cranes, and is home to dozens of fish species and Asiatic black bears, lynxes, and other mammals. In mid-2007, limited freight train service was resumed across the zone, as provided for in the Armistice Agreement. The United States organized an international conference in Geneva for all the belligerents to discuss the political future of Korea. The actual meetings produced no agreement. The Korean Peninsula would continue to be caught in the coils of Cold War rivalry, but the survival of the Republic of Korea kept alive the hope of civil liberties, democracy, economic development, and eventual unification, even if their fulfillment might require another 50 years or more. The war had lasted for 3 years and 1 month and resulted in roughly 4 million casualties, including civilians. South Korean casualties were some 1,313,000, 1 million civilians. Communist casualties were estimated at 2,500,000, including 1 million civilians. The United States lost about 37,000 in action. The official figure, which had been recorded as some 54,000, was revised in 2000 after it was discovered that a clerk had incorrectly included military. Non-combatant deaths worldwide: South Korea, some 47,000, and the UN forces, 3,194. But the estimated losses of China in action were 900,000 men, and of North Korea, 520,000. During the war, 2/5 of Korea's industrial facilities were destroyed and 1/3 of its homes devastated. The U.S. Army had provided South Korea with $181,200. 000 during the Occupation period of 1946 to 48. This money, which was provided under the assistance programs for occupied areas, was spent mainly on preventing hunger and disease. For the period 1949 to 52, the U.S. provided $485,600,000 for economic aid and $12,500,000 for military aid. Following the war, the UN Korean Reconstruction Agency, UNKRA, was established to carry out economic aid to South Korea, with most of the contributions being provided by the United States. The UNKRA came to an end in 1958, but UN emergency relief and aid from other international voluntary agencies continued.